Thank you very much, and Michael, thank you for that unrecognizably flattering introduction. You mentioned my title. I found that it and the correct fare get me on the public transit system anywhere in the world. It's an honor to close this conference, and I thank you all for resisting what must have been the strong temptation to leave early, but we will close it. And unfortunately for you, I have a text here, but I'll not be too rigorously attached to it. I have been asked to give a summary of the development and current condition of conservatism in the United States and Canada. And please allow me to begin with some bits of historical interpretation. The nature of American and Canadian political society, including their somewhat different notions of conservatism, are derived from their early days. Champlain founded Canada with the dream of a great French state in North America, independent, of course, of the Americans. And this dream was modified and relaunched by Sir Guy Carleton, Lord Dorchester, the greatest of the British governors, I think, but as a bicultural country, also independent of the Americans, who had at that point achieved their independence. The Americans began with something like the famous surmise of F. Scott Fitzgerald from, of all places, The Great Gatsby, that I think it's a quote many of you would be familiar with. He described, I'm quoting Fitzgerald, "A land that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the New World. Its trees had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate for his capacity to wonder." This was 30 years before the space age. But Canada, as you would know, was always a sterner vision. And Jacques Cartier said when he first laid eyes on the north shore of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, "It is the land God gave to Cain," a different vision. The incursions of the French from New France, from Quebec, so aggravated New England and New York in the 18th century that, led by their brilliant representative in London, Benjamin Franklin, the Americans prevailed upon the British to expel the French from Canada in the 7 Years' War. Now, that war was actually started by subaltern George Washington, with no authority whatsoever, when he attacked a French fort where Pittsburgh now stands 3 years before the war was declared. And this was really, in a way, the First World War, because it was simultaneously fought in India, the Caribbean, West Africa, North America, and Europe. And it was variously referred to by the contending parties as not only the 7 Years' War, but the French and Indian, Silesian, Pomeranian, and Carnatic Wars. And the fate of Canada and the United States was determined by what had emerged as the division of forces in Europe. France had the greatest army and was impregnable, other than when all of the other European powers together opposed it, as ultimately happened with Napoleon. But Britain had the greatest navy, and Britain could take what it wanted overseas, and France was left with Britain's colonial leavings. The French conundrum was that they could never strategically decide whether they wanted to cross the Rhine or the English Channel. And as a result, apart from Napoleon's magnificent display of military genius, they never crossed either. And while Britain could defeat other European powers overseas, it could not indefinitely sustain an occupation force that was vigorously opposed by the local population. And this is what the Americans demonstrated. The American Revolution was complicated by the fact that approximately a third of the British, led by William Pitt and Edmund Burke, sympathized with the Americans, and approximately a third of the Americans did not want to join the revolution, and a good many of them, as you know, came to Canada, and this intensified British loyalty to protect Canada as all they had left in North America after the departure of the Americans. The future of this continent was effectively determined by one of the great diplomatic achievements in all of history, when Benjamin Franklin, having succeeded in persuading the British to expel the French from North America, then accomplished the astounding feat of convincing the French that they should assist the Americans in expelling the British from America. The British doubled their debt in the 7 Years' War, and that was the largest part of that war, and as the Americans were the wealthiest of all British citizens at that time, the British thought it was reasonable to expect the Americans to help to pay for some of this very expensive colonial campaign that they'd undertaken on behalf of the Americans. Had they required the Americans to accept the stamp tax before they started, the Americans would have agreed to that. But Britain was left in the classically difficult position of trying to extract payment for services that had already been rendered by imposing a tax that they could not ultimately collect in a kindred country 3,000 miles away. As you all know, the Americans responded with the facile argument of no taxation without representation, which is nonsense, because no one ever votes to be taxed unless they absolutely have to have the money. Once the French intervened, after Franklin's unique methods of diplomacy, which included extraordinary liaisons with various members of the French court, it became an impossible, or at least unsustainable, situation for the British. But just remember, Franklin did persuade an absolute monarchy. The last parliament that had met in France was dismissed by Cardinal Richelieu in 1614, 170 years before. And yet France went to war in favor of republicanism, democracy, secession, and revolution. Franklin was a very great diplomat. And once they did so, it was, as I say, not a sustainable situation for the British. France got nothing out of it. The Americans got their independence, the British kept Canada, and France was simply dismissed by Franklin. Now, they had some sensation of revenge against Britain, but it was only 6 years later that the Bastille fell. The French had their own revolution, which swiftly descended into the reign of terror, followed by 20 years of war that extended French rule from Lisbon to Moscow and from Copenhagen to Naples and even to Alexandria, but cost the French 1 million lives and established the British as the greatest power in the world for a century after the Battle of Waterloo. Canada had the time it needed to launch itself peacefully as a country, and the United States had a heroic start. It held the world's attention, and it has not forfeited it these 250 years. All serious countries have a mythos, and the leaders of the American Revolution were an awkward alliance of avaricious Boston lawyers and Southern slaveholding plantation owners, but they built a magnificent mythos. The effective cause of the American Revolution, as we have seen, had little to do with human rights and was really a rather grubby tax squabble. The prominence among the revolutionaries of slaveholders made America's claimed raison d'etre as the world's new and unique repository of human freedom implausible. The chief author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, even began by including in that document blaming the British for the importation of slavery to America. He arraigned King George III, poor old Farmer George, who wasn't a great king, but he wasn't a bad man. He arraigned him virtually as if he were a defendant at the Nuremberg trials. And when he thought of putting in this allegation that Britain had imported slavery to America, John Adams and Franklin, who were both abolitionists, said that given his status as a slave owner and the alleged fact that he sired 7 children with one of his female slaves, there might be credibility problems. In the late 18th century, though some countries are defined by dynastic connections, like the Habsburgs in Vienna, almost all the established countries were defined by cultural unity. The English spoke English, the French spoke French, Spanish, Russians, Portuguese, Dutch, they all spoke their own language. The United States, of course, was only the second English-speaking country. And in order to endow itself with a compelling identity as a basis of national purpose and morale, it staked out from the start its standing as the world's premier haven for human rights and liberty. Now, on its face, it is preposterous that America, as the world's principal slaveholding country, represented itself as a new order of the ages where it was held to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Americans had no more civic freedom after the Revolution than before, other than that they had their own resident government in America. And they had no more rights than the British or the Swiss or the Dutch or most of the Scandinavians. But they had the advantage of distance from Europe, with comparatively few class stratifications and ethnic prejudices, almost a continent of their own, which offered the world access to a land of unlimited wealth and opportunity under a stable constitutional government, and as all the world knows, it was a brilliant launch. While Canada's experience was forcibly more modest than the Americans, it was not, I believe, ultimately less promising or distinguished. In the War of the American Revolution and the War of 1812 that followed 30 years later, Canada narrowly resisted American attempts to suborn or conquer it, largely because the French were loyal to the agreement that they had made with Carleton in the Quebec Act of 1774. After 4 years lobbying the home government, Carleton wrung from Britain for the French Canadians that Great Britain would guarantee the liberty of the Roman Catholic Church, which was officially discriminated against everywhere else in the British Empire at that time, and that the French language and the French civil law would be conserved and protected, and the French Quebecers would remain loyal to the British Crown. This was a brilliant and fateful act of statesmanship by Carleton. In 2 long lifetimes, from the Battle of Yorktown to the end of World War II and the beginning of the Atomic Age, 1783 to 1945, 162 years. In that time, America rose from a few million colonists on a distant shore to the greatest eminence ever enjoyed by any state or government in history, an influence that has permeated the entire world for over a century and, despite current perturbations, remains at its crest today. What Canadians, in my view, generally fail to recognize is that we essentially kept pace with that growth. Without the mighty and unprecedentedly propagandized mythos of the world's self-nominated, but also, it must be said, widely accepted trustee and supreme hope for human liberty. The Americans from 1783 to 1945 multiplied in population by 40, from 3.2 million to 135 million. But Canada multiplied by 60, from 200,000 to 12 million. The Americans walked on eggshells as the great issue of slavery remained to be resolved in the first half of the 19th century. And by the 1840s, Canadians concluded that they rightfully must have the same civic liberties and authority to elect their own leaders as their British and American cousins. Revolution, the American precedent, was not possible because we could have dispensed with the British easily enough, but they would have immediately been succeeded by Americans as occupiers. In the awkward and not evidently heroic manner of much of Canada's political development, Canada generated the Gilbert and Sullivan rebellions of 1837 by Louis-Joseph Papineau and William Lyon Mackenzie, in which 325 people died, but the great majority of people were loyal to the British. And the effect was precisely as had been hoped, not by the insurrectionists, but by those who subdued them. That is, that the British recognized that something had to be done, but they were not so exasperated that they lost patience with Canada and traded it away to the United States, which they could easily have done for some other consideration the Americans would have given them. In their ineffable manner, the British, confused but benign, produced a solution which, had it been strictly enacted, would have assured the complete failure of Canada, but which was designed to end discontent in Canada by requiring the assimilation of the French Canadians to the English Canadians. Now, this, of course, was anathema to the French, and the English didn't particularly desire it either, English Canadians. The British governor, Durham, was sacked for exceeding his authority, but his plan to unify Quebec and Ontario in the so-called United Province of Canada was implemented. And so the first authentic Canadian-born political leaders, Robert Baldwin and Louis-Hippolyte Lafontaine, acquiesced in the Union and initiated French-English cooperation. Instead of trying to use that union as a tool to assimilate the French as Durham had intended, Baldwin and Lafontaine turned it into an engine for agitation for sovereignty in a bicultural country. Almost all powers except foreign policy were achieved in 1848, a year marked by great upheaval in Europe, including the overthrow of the Orleans dynasty in France and its replacement by the Second Republic led by Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon III, and by the overthrow in Vienna of the long-serving Chancellor Metternich after 39 years. And with that, having achieved what they wanted, Baldwin and Lafontaine retired from politics, like Cincinnatus or George Washington. They were now office seekers. When the slavery issue, which had long immobilized the United States, was resolved by the U.S. Civil War, in which 750,000 Americans died out of a population of 31 million, the United States emerged with the greatest army and the greatest generals in the world, and a profound lack of appreciation for the fact that the British had very obviously, sentimentally favored the success of the attempt by the southern states to secede from the Union. In the circumstances, the leadership of most parties among the French and English Canadians recommended to the British the swift confederation of all the British entities near the U.S. border and an attempt to organize the territory as an autonomous country and extend it to the Pacific Ocean beside a transcontinental railway. I mean, this was an astonishingly bold vision. And the United States, after its horrible war, was in no mood for conflict with Great Britain. But the new Dominion government in 1867 judged it prudent to deploy 50,000 soldiers and militiamen, a military force, I may say, in a country of a little over 2 million people, approximately equal to what we have now been reduced to by successive governments disarming this country. Deployed these 50,000 people at all the border points to prevent the raids of these fanatics, the Fenian Irish, more peppy elements of the large American Irish community that fled the old country and were still full of hostility to the British, which they visited upon us unsuccessfully. The principal personality and chief founder of this country, John A. Macdonald, was the leading figure at the Washington Conference of American and British diplomats and himself in 1871. And he established Canada in the eyes of both senior powers as a distinct national entity with legitimate national interests. Canada's emergence as an independent country could thus hardly be more easily distinguishable from that of the United States 85 years before. The Americans fought their way to independence with a citizens' army shouldering their own rifles and sponsored by France. And Canada was given birth by Britain with no violence and no tradition of armed self-help or military activity. The senior country seized its independence and elaborated a stirring, if factually somewhat embellished, spirit of heroic assertion of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Canada was born painlessly and had the rather more bucolic objectives of peace, order, and good government conferred upon us by our distant imperial queen protectress. The United States was always unique in its sense of showmanship and of the spectacle. And you see it throughout its history, from the Declaration of Independence to the Super Bowl. But in Canada, as historian W.L. Morton remarked, we have a country strong only in moderation and governable only by compromise. That does not deprive this country of the nobility of its achievements. Canada was bound together by a railway that was a wonder of the world, infinitely more difficult to lay down over the Canadian Shield than the competing railways in the United States, and in a country that had no serious capital market, so all the money had to be raised elsewhere. And in the nearly 50 years between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of World War I, the United States expanded economically and demographically on a scale that the world had never thought to be possible. It almost tripled in population in that time, and it consistently ran non-inflationary economic growth numbers of close to 10% annually. Canada actually kept pace with that. We almost tripled in population also, although it meant advertising throughout much of Europe for immigration and accepting as many as 6% of our population in 1 year as immigrants in order not to be simply overwhelmed by the contiguity of the Americans. Wilfrid Laurier effectively saved Canadian Confederation in 1917 by telling the Prime Minister, Robert Borden, that if he imposed conscription for combat service overseas in World War I on the French Canadians, who felt no mother country loyalty to either France or Britain, Britain wasn't their mother, and they felt the French just deserted them and took everything but the roofs off their houses with them. Not an unjust opinion, by the way. If this was done just by vote of Parliament, he, Laurier, would lose the leadership of French Canadians to Henri Bourassa, and Quebec would be waiting to secede. he said that Borden would win an election on a referendum, and that would be sufficiently democratic for him to maintain the leadership of most French Canadians. This is what occurred, and as Laurier also predicted, though not to Borden, because of the stranglehold the Liberals then gained on Quebec, the Liberals also won 12 of the next 14 full-term general elections and governed for 51 of the 63 years between 1921 and 1984. As a country with a revolutionary tradition, the United States has always considered the right to own and carry firearms as implicit in the success of the American Revolution and in the right and ability of all Americans to protect their property. This was stated in the Declaration of Independence, in particular reference to the native people, whom Jefferson described in ungenerous terms, to say the least. This helped give to American conservatism the character of individualism, of the rugged citizen, practically completely independent of the state and in some respects suspicious of it, patriotic and participating in political life, but above all in a society of individuals in which the unallocated powers clause of the Bill of Rights attached to the Constitution at its outset holds that powers not accorded to the federal government belong to the states or to the people, to individual citizens themselves. In Canada, conservatism, as we all know, has always been just an alternative policy to liberalism. First, the Burkean liberal tradition of wide freedom of choice and behavior, and more recently, the statist, more dirigist, big government model. In the United States, conservatism has been an enlarged private sector, relatively low taxes, a relatively unregulated meritocracy, and a foreign policy more based on the national interest than on collegial interests. The constitutional right to bear arms has been indicative and supportive of the muscular citizenship of a very free people. In Canada, the imperial monarchical state conferred liberties that conservatives and liberals benefit from and exercise in a narrower band of prerogatives, largely defined by rates of tax and the extent of behavioral regulation. This brings us to the perturbed present, where a glance at both Canada and the United States, and Great Britain as well, might incite the inference that the mainly English-speaking countries have lost the capacity for self-government. But with regime change, as both Canada and the US have surely earned, at least earned the right to enact it, we could slightly replicate the tale of the tortoise and the hare. It is unwise to be too confident in explaining complex historical phenomena, but it appears that what Mr. Lincoln called the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil, slavery, when it was finally abolished, created a reservoir of resentment in the U.S. African American community that was as much released as appeased by the confirmation of racial equality and the end of segregation, a century after the end of slavery. It is certainly possible to identify with the anger of African Americans, but it should also be remembered that no society in the history of the world has made such an immense effort as the United States has, not only to emancipate a formerly subjugated and servile group, but to raise it up to a state of absolute equality with the majority. But the combination of the legacy of slavery in a country with 400 million firearms, as we can all see, has produced some manifestations of freedom that are distressingly violent. Now let's look at our prospects. I regret speaking unflatteringly of the American administration when that country's president is visiting us. I always respect that great office, and I always respect the holder of it. And indeed, it has been my privilege, a great privilege, to know, except for this incumbent and the president whom he served, Obama, except for those two, every president of the United States, starting with Lyndon Johnson. The impressive group of men they are. But however the, frankly, largely contemptible national political media of the United States may try to disguise the fact, the current administration is a disaster. Inflation, workforce shrinkage, the deluge of 5,000 or more illiterate peasants flooding illegally across the southern border every day, covering the smuggling of literally tons of fentanyl, from which more Americans die every year than in all the wars of the United States since 1945, the green terror, the imminent arrival of Iran as a nuclear power to join North Korea, the abandonment of $85 billion of modern military hardware to the Taliban, skyrocketing crime rates and collapsed education standards. This will not be defensible in the elections next year. The ultimate demonstration of the debility of the American political structure is the 7-year lawless assault on Donald Trump. Having known him for 25 years, I'm well aware of his shortcomings, and I'm not particularly puritanical about how politics are conducted. But the leadership of the intelligence agencies and the FBI were knowingly complicit in a completely false allegation against Trump of illegal collusion with a foreign power to distort the 2016 presidential election result. Trump was subjected to 2 unfounded impeachment trials, was deprived of re-election largely by recourse to an unconstitutional use of millions of unsolicited, unverifiable, imprecisely distributed ballots. And he was accused of fomenting an insurrection when he had in fact warned the House Speaker that there could be hooligans among the large crowd of his own followers, and he offered 20,000 National Guardsmen as reinforcement for the Capitol, and Speaker Pelosi declined. The 2 ultimate guardrails protecting the American presidential selection process are that the courts will not overturn an apparent presidential election result, and ex-presidents are not indicted. If the notoriously politicized U.S. justice system, to which Michael Binion referred, has been so deformed that a stale-dated response to a blackmail attempt by a nightclub stripper is reconfigured as a crime charged against Trump, it will either assure his re-election or confirm that the United States is no longer in its most important constitutional function, a society of laws. In a country where federal prosecutors, as Michael mentioned, abuse the plea bargain rules by extorting and suborning testimony with threats and promises of non-prosecution for perjury to achieve a 98% success rate in federal prosecutions, 95% of those without a trial, that is not such a drastic step as it might seem. Either the Democrats will think better of the alleged pending prosecution of Trump, or he will be reelected, or both. In order to sell Trumpism without Trump, the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, had to oppose the indictment of Trump unconditionally, as Mike Pence did and Nikki Haley did, and some others. DeSantis flunked that litmus test. If he can't do damage control or produce a rival issue to the persecution of Trump, I think he will have to wait until 2028. As for Canada, Quebec has effectively begun the formal extirpation of the English language, and the Prime Minister has taken it upon himself to make to the world, on behalf of all of us, the confession that our forebears attempted some form of genocide on the native people. I put it to you that no government that has acquiesced in the first and proclaimed the second is fit to be re-elected. Apart from those problems, we are suffering from a severe annual deficit in investment capital flows, are steadily falling in comparative national per capita wealth measurement. I mentioned to Michael's group last night that we're about to be passed by South Korea and Israel. And South Korea, the ceasefire in 1953 was a rubble heap. There was hardly a building standing in that country. And they certainly had never manufactured an automobile or built a ship. And Israel, when it was founded as the State of Israel, 1947, 48, was, to quote Pontius Pilate, a land of sand, camels, and Jehovah, and they are about to pass us in standard of living. Our education system is a colossal unemployment deferral scheme. That at immense public expense graduates huge numbers of people in fields from which they could not possibly make a living. As for our healthcare system, as we all know, it is inadequate and almost insolvent, and is now reduced to advocating the merits of suicide to reduce its deficit. Our strength in Canada is natural resources, and instead of making the most of them, we regard them with shame and neglect, and have declared war on our greatest industry, oil and gas. And no one in our history has won 4 consecutive full terms except MacDonald and Laurier. And the amiable incumbent is not in their category. I believe that Pierre Poilievre will be elected, that he will effectively defend conservatism from the inevitable barrage of partisan and media obloquy as harsh and primitive by explaining it accurately as greater freedom for individual Canadians with no diminution of benefit for the disadvantaged. In doing so, I think we will graduate back to having a functioning two-party system for the first time since before World War I, except for the Mulrooney-Turner years. The world is rubbing its eyes in astonishment at the woke self-mutilation of America and the sophomoric morality play of government in Canada. I believe that in the one country, as in the other, we will not continue to disappoint a world that has come to expect and desperately needs us to do better. Thank you very much.